With cheap watches so accessible from AliExpress that look just like our favourite much more expensive watches, it can be very tempting to pick one up in the hope that having and wearing that watch will stop us from wanting or needing the original. Especially when you see the specs they cram in for the price. Well, today we're going to see if they really do scratch the itch, or if they just make the cravings even worse. Welcome to Addicted to Watches. It's interesting how we can discover and rediscover watches. Over the last few months, I've found myself looking and liking a model that I knew about for a long time, but didn't take too much notice of. That's the Longines Spirit. Specifically, the 37mm non-GMT version. It's a clean and simple watch that has a very pleasant design. I've become more and more drawn to it lately. As you'd expect, AliExpress has me covered with a watch that looks very similar, but for a fraction of the price. This is the Pagani Design PD1717. Well, technically this is the PD1717 V2, but I'll get to that later. What you need to know for now is that it's got the look and a whole lot of specifications for not a lot of money. The original by Longines will set you back $4,125 dues currently, and in the States, $2,500. This Pagani cost me about 95 Australian or 62 US dollars, which makes it somewhere around 2.5% of the price of the real deal. As we begin to look at the watch now, I'll start by saying that this watch both disappointed me and surprised me. My first impressions holding the watch was that it was pretty underwhelming, but as I spent more time with it, I liked it more. Those shortcomings are still present, but I think the good things about this watch more than outweigh them. What really impressed me about this watch is the dial. It honestly looks like it belongs on a watch much more expensive than this. Of course, the design actually does, but the execution of this Pagani design is very well done. I was almost going to get the black option, but I'm glad I went for the blue. This shade of blue combined with the sunburst finish is really mesmerizing. Sunburst blues can often easily be too overdone and as a result make a watch look cheap. I also find that the shades of blue often used are quite vibrant and saturated. I think those can be a bit in your face and a bit too much. This blue, on the other hand, is more subdued, with a little bit of green tinted in the mix. In person, I'd probably call it something like sea blue, and in terms of my preferences, I'd say this is second only to the navy blue that IWC use on their watches like the Mark XX. The sunburst finish means that depending on the light, the dial transitions from a deep blue that is almost black to a shade of blue I like so much. The effect is not as pronounced as many other watches with sunburst dials, which keeps it a little bit more low-key, and the shifts in colour, while dynamic, are not so dramatic that it becomes distracting. Adorning that blue backdrop is a ring of polished Arabic numerals that encircle the dial. These are all lume-filled and have thin polished surrounds that occasionally catch the light and create subtle highlights on the dial. Just beyond these, and printed instead of applied, are small white diamonds that creep slightly into the chapter ring. Also printed is the brand logo at 12. I'm okay with this being printed instead of applied, as it might have looked a bit busy with an applied logo. What is interesting here though, is that the brand has printed the logo only, with no written script or brand name. The vast majority of their watches have both logo and brand name on the dial, so it makes me wonder why they didn't do it here. It's not a complaint though, as it keeps the dial uncluttered and allows everything a bit of room to breathe. Below the pinion, we have one other bit of printing in the form of the water resistance rating and the word automatic. A complaint I've had with other watches, and so this one again, is the slightly redundant conversion of 20 bar to 200 meters. Either one is more than enough, but not both. Around the outside of the dial, there is also a raised chapter ring to give you a read of the minutes. Inside of this, it has a very thin, finely polished edge that occasionally catches the light and adds a small detail that elevates the feel of the dial. On the chapter ring itself, minutes as well as part minutes are printed, and at each 5, there are very small Arabics printed too. I really like this minute track design. There's a lot of detail, but it's not too distracting from the rest of the dial. The relatively small size definitely helps with that. The hands on this watch are simple and straightforward, which suits the watch overall. They're more or less fence post in shape, and the seconds hand has a red arrow tip for a little bit of colour contrasting nicely with the blue. Earlier I mentioned that this watch is the V2. That's because the original version had hands that were much smaller than this, and looked very undersized for the watch. Pagani listened to feedback from reviews, and in version 2 increased the size. I think that now they got it right, and the proportions are much better. Moving out a little, and we come to the crystal. It's a sapphire crystal, which is nice because you won't really have to worry about scratches, and it's pleasantly domed. It's definitely a single dome, because when you turn the watch and get it on even a slight angle, you start to get a lot of distortion. It can be a little distracting, and a bit more than is really necessary, but generally it doesn't get in the way of reading the time. When the light hits it, you can also see that blue tint, meaning that there is an anti-reflective coating applied to the underside of the crystal. It does a good enough job, I think, and especially when you consider the price you're paying for this watch. The case is another standout of this watch for me. Maybe not when it comes to the quality of finishing, though it is perfectly reasonable for the price, but the shape, size and way it wears. I have heard that the original Longines has very long lugs, which makes it wear larger than you might think. This Pagani, on the other hand, feels like just about the perfect size for me. In terms of case diameter, we have a size of 38mm, which is just a bit bigger than one of the sizes available for the Longines. Lug to lug is also kept in check at 44.7mm, and, while a little higher due to the crystal, height comes in at 13.2mm. These overall dimensions keep everything pretty neat on wrist, and in my opinion, a good size for an everyday watch. In terms of the case, it's pretty much the same as the original Longines, both in terms of shape and finishing pattern. For the bezel, we're looking at a multifaceted polished and brushed bezel. The brushing on top tones it down, but the polished angled surface still provides enough to create some really nice reflections. The top of the case is similarly brushed, as are the flat sides of the case. These surfaces are broken up by a slim polished chamfer, which works really well to highlight the case shape. From the side, the lugs do angle down quite sharply from the bezel, which helps the watch to wear very comfortable and not feel thick. From the side, we also get a look at the crown. It's signed with the Pagani design logo and screws down, which helps to provide that 200 meters of water resistance. The crown is quite a good size, making it easy to unscrew when winding or setting the watch. Also screw down is the case back. The design of this is pretty simple and straightforward. They're not breaking any new ground here, but honestly, I don't care that much about the case back, so this is more than adequate. What lies beneath is of course the ever-present, ever-reliable Seiko NH35. In budget automatic watches, this movement is a no-brainer, and has performed well for me. It hacks, hand winds, beats 6 times per second or 3 Hz, and has a power reserve of roughly 40 hours. For the money, it's hard to beat. It is, however, not the prettiest movement, so a display caseback isn't always necessary. Now, we get to the only real negative when it comes to this watch, and the reason I was initially disappointed with it: the bracelet. Pagani bracelets are notorious for feeling cheap and flimsy. Well, I can confirm that the reputation is well deserved. While the bracelet looks decent enough, it's very light and cheap feeling in hand. Once it's on your wrist, you don't really notice it so much, so for me it's not a huge issue. But when you do handle the watch, you can really feel where the corner was cut. That said, it still looks decent with the watch, and is easy enough to swap out for another strap too if you want to. It's designed to look like a 7-piece link, with those polished sections running either side of the mid-link, and, while not 7, it's still a respectable 5-piece by the look of it from the back. As it leaves the case, it tapers from 20 to 18mm before arriving at another letdown, the clasp. It's the basic $3 clasp you can get from AliExpress, with 3 holes for micro adjustment, a fold-over tab and milled scissor. It at least matches the rest of the bracelet in feeling a bit light and cheap, That said, once again, when it's on wrist, it isn't really something you feel or notice, so I can let it slide, especially considering the price. It's time to get it on wrist. I mentioned already that I really like the size. It sits in between the sizes of the Longines watches, and I think it gets it just about right. I'd say it's slightly on the small side, but not too much. It's exactly what I wanted from the watch, and as a result, wears perfectly for me. The height does come into play a little bit, as it sits at over 13mm, but by the time you turn your wrist enough to notice it, the crystal and its distortion draws your attention away from that. If you really can't stand the cheap bracelet, swapping it out for something like this brown leather will take away one of the few negatives that the watch has. The bracelet is already comfortable enough, but a leather strap takes it a step further in terms of comfort. If you really need to feel metal on your wrist, you could also wear it on a mesh bracelet like this one. Longines use this style of strap on a few of their other watches, and I think it works well on this Pagani too. As we've been looking at the watch, I'm sure you've also seen not just the bezel and crystal catching the light, but also that sunburst dial with its fantastic shade of blue. So, now we come back to the whole point of this video. Does having and wearing this watch make me feel like I don't need the original on my wrist, or do I just want it even more? Well, I can say that I have really enjoyed wearing this watch. A little more than I expected to be honest. I think that comes down to three things. The first is that obviously I like the design, even though it's not Pagani who came up with it. Second is the way it wears. The shape and size of the case, as well as the combination of brushed and polished surfaces, is, in my opinion, really well balanced. Once again, credit for this goes to Longines, not Pagani. Finally, and most unexpectedly for me, was the colour of the dial. It's not quite the same as the blue that Longines use, with a slightly stronger leaning towards green, but I think it's a very nice shade of blue, and looks like it belongs on a much more expensive watch. I also think it really benefits from the extra millimeter on the case, which just beefs it up ever so slightly. While it may not always be the case for these homage watches, and there are definitely things that could be improved on, in this instance, for me personally, I would say that it does indeed scratch the itch. I'm perfectly happy to keep rocking this watch, and while I wouldn't say no if an original magically popped into my lap, I'm not actively looking for one anymore. Different people may have different experiences with how they feel wearing a homage of a watch they like, but in this case, I think it has more to do with the intentions that I have going into this. What I like about the Longines is the design, so having more or less the same design means I can be content with this. If I was drawn more to the brand as a whole, or the story behind it, then I would probably be making a very different video. Now clearly, this is a universe apart from the original when it comes to the quality and finishing, but for what I get out of it, this Pagani does fit the bill. As it stands, I don't expect to be buying a Longines anytime in the near future. What do you think about this watch? Do you have a Pagani in your collection? Would you not be caught wearing a homage like this? Should I just get the original? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time.